One of the biggest challenges that we have is you today in Perth, as an individual, you'll probably see 10 to 12,000 different commercial messages. You find that moment, that insight, that thing that is going to lift us from the 99 to the 1%. If I look at the total volume of advertising globally, it's about $1 trillion a year spent in marketing around the world. Half of that money, $500 billion, goes to Alphabet, goes to Meta, or goes to Amazon. New AI sort of based technologies is really replacing that human buying and selling process. The human involvement will occur much earlier in the process in terms of strategic thought. The Trumpet Patriot campaign media spend are about 60 million nationally for almost no political gain.
The new way of interacting with the younger audience through different channels like TikTok, Instagram, the medium of podcasting.
Before we get started, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode of our cutting-edge contemporary conversations. Thank you.
Welcome, Adam. How are you?
Very well, thank you, David. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you for your time today. You have a fairly breadth of experience within the marketing and the media space. Before we delve into those specifics, I would like you to share your story, your background, and how did you end up in what you're doing now?
Sure. Well, I started my career in the UK, in London. My first job in advertising was in the mailroom of a full-service advertising agency called Young and Rubicam, which in those days was one of the biggest agencies in London and had network offices around the world. In the mailroom, so my job each day was sort of pick up the post because we didn't have sort of email like we have on the scale of this time. So I would roll the sort of mailroom trolley around the different floors of the building a couple of times a day, dropping off mail, picking up mail. The lovely thing about that experience was you got to see the whole business in operation. So you were sort of getting this exposure to the inner workings of an ad agency and all the different components that sort of went into that. And it was a tradition that executive positions were sort of recruited from the mailroom. So you had these very earnest young people sort of delivering the mail with one eye on sort of trying to capture the person's attention who might be in charge of a particular department to sort of get a spot should a vacancy occur. And I was sort of attracted to the media team. So at that stage, the media team was just a part of the agency. It hadn't broken out yet, which was, to follow across the industry. So there was an opening that came up there. I joined the media team and began my media career as a junior TV buyer and spent a couple of years at Y&R and then went to OMD in London. A few years there. I left there to join Initiative Media. From Initiative, I went to Capital Radio, which was my first time working on the ad sales side instead of the media buying side. And then I fell in love with an Australian and we moved to Perth and I joined the brand agency in Perth, worked in their media team. We launched an agency there called Maxis, which was part of the Group M stable of agencies. This is getting very technical in terms of the brands.
That's fine.
And then from there went to OMD in Perth and then I moved up to Asia. I lived in Singapore and I was head of trading across the APAC region for Mindshare. And that was an incredible job. Had billions of dollars worth of media investment that was under my responsibility. A lot of time traveling, a lot of time in China and India in particular. They were the two largest markets that I was responsible for. So I got this amazing life experience of visiting all these weird and wonderful places, doing business in these different markets, but ultimately got a bit homesick and the opportunity came up to move back to Perth. So I took the leadership of an agency, a media agency here called Cara, and then 7 years ago left there and became the CEO of MarketForce. And if you don't know MarketForce, it's Perth's oldest ad agency. It's over 50 years old. We're part of the Clemenger Group, so part of Australia's largest marketing services network, and have a broad range of services under our sort of brand locally. And that's one of the best things of my role is that we get to work in all these different parts of advertising and marketing, very similar to how I started my career in a full service agency, and get to sort of lead that business, lead the team there, and get to work with some great clients and hopefully produce some good work.
Lovely. It's a long journey. it's a long journey covering different assets of or aspects of media. Could you talk a bit more the air at the first role when you got? How do you sell airspace?
Yeah,
and it's when you are talking to clients, what's the learning curve of sales process or learning curve of understanding I'm selling airtime?
Yes, it was always something that confused my parents as well, because my role was TV buyer, and they thought that meant that I bought TVs for like a big electrical retailer. So that was like a joke. So yeah, that's right. You're buying air or buying time. That's what we used to call it. It's a finite resource because the moment that ad break goes to air, it's gone forever. So there is a constant requirement to trade, so to keep selling and buying. In the UK, when I joined the industry, it was a very high pressured buying and selling environment. So it was very similar to those sort of old fashioned images of stockbrokers sort of yelling at each other, but via telephone. So and the reason for that is the market in the UK in those days was what we called preemptible. So it was a live auction occurring every sort of second of the day. So I could phone ITV, the biggest commercial station, one of their regional franchises, buy a spot in that evening's programming. So let's say Coronation Street, the number one show in the UK at the time. You might spend £20,000-30,000 to buy that. And 10 minutes later, you could get a phone call from the sales rep saying, I've just sold this to one of your competitors. I've sold your spot for 35,000. Right now, do you want to buy it back for 40? So you're in this sort of real trading environment, and then you've got to quickly do some maths and go, okay, well, I could probably afford 40, but I can't go much higher than that. And then you've got to then balance that against your daily, weekly, monthly campaign budget. So it's quite a mathematical process, but at the same time, real thinking on your feet type environment. And very adversarial, which was quite, interesting and fun. But the weird part of it was because of the way the technology worked. So you'd trade in the morning for that evening's airtime. But by about 1 o'clock, everything stopped because the TV stations would close the logs for that day. They physically had to sort of take the logs, so where the ads were going to fall in the breaks, put them in some instances on an aeroplane to fly to the north of the UK where they were going to get broadcast, or to Scotland or Ireland. And you couldn't do anything at that point, right? It was gone. Physically, the day had ended. So you had this sort of wasteland of an afternoon where there was nothing happening. And it all started again the next morning. Because if you did anything that afternoon, the first thing that would happen in the morning is someone would call you and go, all your spots have gone, someone's bought them from under you. So you had this constant turnover of trading, which was enormous fun, very high pressured. And there's lots of sort of good and bad stories from that. But that mechanism, that way of trading has been replaced now. So if we look at how modern media is bought and sold, the majority happens electronically through a process we refer to as programmatic buying, which just means electronic trading. So often, we're working through platforms, working through online booking systems. Those systems are configured to work in different electronic marketplaces. There's lots of different filters and caveats that you can put into that. You're still reconciling budgets, so you're not over or underspending for a client, etc. But it's a much more precise way of doing things, and as a consequence, more and more of that trading work is being done by computers and algorithms and so on. There's still an element of human planning and buying that occurs through the process, but we are seeing that being rapidly disrupted. Even this week, one of the major global media networks has announced that it's changing its infrastructure. It's likely to make lots of redundancies because new AI sort of based technologies is really replacing that human buying and selling process. So within a matter of years, or maybe shorter time frame than that, the way that media is traded around the world will be a completely different landscape, one largely driven by machines. And the human involvement will occur much earlier in the process in terms of strategic thought and added value, but the mechanism of buying and selling will be automated.
As localized organizations who are very, regional based, for example, somebody from Western Australia selling to the clients within Western Australia. They might not be focusing on media across Australia, on telly, on air, and in physical presence. So how do you? So what's the process like? How do you think about saying, okay, this is the offering, and how do you go about structuring the delivery?
Yeah, it's a very involved process, and it's an enormously fun process as well. So with our clients, the first thing that we would look to do is to sort of take a brief from them. So we want to understand the key dynamics of why they're investing in marketing. So, and that includes things that are quite straightforward, like how much money do you have to spend, who you're trying to reach with your product or service or communications, what level of investment have you made in creative work, so have you got a TV ad, for example, or whatever other assets are available. We take all that information and we go through what we call a sort of 4-step process. So the first step is sort of diagnosing that brief from the client. Have we understood their challenge properly? Have we understood the market context of what they're trying to do? Have we understood what competitors are doing that might influence the outcome? What channels are they present in? What's their weight of advertising look like? So we sort of do this diagnosis of the problem itself and how that then applies to marketing. The next phase, which is one that where agencies I think add enormous value, is looking at the target audiences in more detail. So understanding the lifestyles, the media consumption habits, the emotional and rational motivations of the people that we're trying to talk to, understanding that customer journey, what does it look like from becoming first aware of a product or service through to purchase and then potential advocacy and promotion through that individual's channels in support of the brand. And that's a very involved process. And we're looking at a variety of different data sources to inform ourselves through that, so we understand all the different research about target audiences, habits and so on, and how that would influence the channels that we would use. And then we get into the ideation phase. So now we're looking at ideas that's going to elevate this campaign, because one of the biggest challenges that we have is you today in Perth as an individual, you'll probably see 10 to 12,000 different commercial messages. So there's an enormous amount of advertising clutter in the world. And the reality is you will ignore 99% of those messages. Our job is to make our clients that 1%, the 1% that the audience takes some notice of and then, hopefully takes some action and that leads to a purchase or a sale or a change in behaviour. And so the strategy process, the ideation of sort of cutting through that clutter, a lot of work, a lot of sort of, creativity that we're going to apply to that process to find that moment, that insight, that thing that is going to lift us from the 99 to the 1%. Once we've done that, we want to explode that idea. We want to find every mechanism possible to connect to the audiences. So here we start getting into what we would call the channel planning phase, looking at individual media, how we want to execute within those media, what's the right level of investment in those media. It's a combination of sort of science and art to define that outcome. And then hopefully we've got a campaign that we can then take live. The nice thing about modern marketing is that we get real-time results. So we know instantaneously how well particular assets or channels are performing. We surface all that information so we can then talk to our clients more informed around changes that we want to make throughout a campaign to lead to the best outcomes possible. And then when it's all done, take a step back, have a brief, usually have a nice bite to eat with the client, assess all the performance and then feed that back into the process all over again. So there's this continuous learning that's occurring that it hopefully is elevating the performance of the campaign and the brand over the longer term as well. So that's sort of the end-to-end process. There's lots of different moving parts in there.
Yeah. What's your in your observation in terms of the changes in demographics have occurred and the way people consume media has also changed? So what are the trends are you observing in the recent years and the last couple of decades as well? Yeah. So if you do a bit of a comparison early in the century and then now, what kind of demographic shifts and the way people consume media?
Yeah, I mean, that's an enormous topic for us. It's one that we spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to understand, and then what do those changes mean for our clients and the way that we help them with their marketing. I mean, technology as an enabler of change is an incredible factor over the last 20 years. If you think about how people consumed media or lived their lives at the turn of the century to today, it's completely transformational. And a lot of those changes have occurred so quickly. A lot of the time, the challenge is just sort of keeping pace. And you look at the emergence of channels that, if you go back 25 years, there wasn't a Facebook, there wasn't a Google, there wasn't a YouTube, certainly wasn't a TikTok. And now these channels are preeminent. They are consuming the industry that I work in. If I look at the total volume of advertising globally, it's about $1 trillion a year spent in marketing around the world. Half of that money, $500 billion, goes to Alphabet, goes to Meta, or goes to Amazon. None of those businesses existed at the turn of the century. So this is a whole new universe that we're operating in. Audiences and generations have sort of, experienced this change. They've lived through it. So their habits, the way that they consume media and marketing, the way they buy things, the way they live their lives, it's all been transformed by these technologies. And as a consequence, the way that we would talk about audiences has changed significantly. At a sort of more macro level, a lot of time we refer to the generations because there are common characteristics between generations, and we've got these new labels of Gen X, Gen Y, alphas now, and soon to follow betas and so on. So you kind of have this sort of these segments that you can go into, and you can look at characteristics and habits. And it's interesting because at one level you think, well, it's quite superficial, right? That you can't just lump everybody born between a certain period of time into one group. But then you actually look at their characteristics, and they share a lot of the same habits. They look at things very similarly, and as a consequence, very differently to other generations. So from a marketing perspective, you probably need to then think about, okay, how we talk to this group is going to be different to how we talk to this group, and how these different groups are going to interact with our messages is going to be different as well. One of the recent trends that we're seeing with younger generations, so your Gen Zs and so on, is this increase in using social media platforms to fulfill search queries. Whereas my generation, we're quite familiar with Google and we use all our searching through Google. But these guys are using TikTok to search. So that's a recent shift that we've seen occur literally in the last sort of couple of years. So when we think about search and performance media and how we want to react to consumer queries about a product or service, we need to have a plan of attack for that particular channel to satisfy that demographic and generation. There is just an enormous amount of information around how people are, how they operate, what they do. And the other great thing about the technology, and it depends, we can have a conversation about privacy and data and so on, but we know more about consumer and audience habits than we've ever known. And again, a lot of that information comes to us in real time. So we can see trends emerging as they start to sort of prick the consciousness of a generation or a group, and then how that then expands, and then what we can be doing to capitalise on that opportunity. So, yeah, we could talk for a long time about all this.
I'll tell you a campaign run in 1911 in the subcontinent.
Right.
They were launching cigarettes. So the English opened this company called National Tobacco Company in 1911 or 12 in that part of India. And then they wanted to market that because people were used to smoking, the hookah or the bidi, which is the leaf with tobacco rolled in. And what they did was they had a very indigenous campaign, as in they had an elephant. So they had multiple elephants, and they got a normal guy to sit on the elephant, dress up in a more of a formal clothing, and then smoke cigarettes across, and then they went around across towns and villages, just across the country, just doing that, just smoking cigarettes and going around. People are watching, what's happening? Yeah. And then that's
influencer marketing on an elephant,
that is a different time and age, not that far ago, 110 years ago, but that was a campaign to sell cigarettes, or because that product was not there in the market at all.
Yeah.
So just to replace, and then that had replaced a majority of the consumers of smoking. But smoking, we don't suggest people should smoke. It's injurious to health. But if you have to bring a parallel to that, if we want to introduce a new product today, which is not in that stream of products, and not thought about, how do you introduce the new product today?
I mean, budget would be the key thing to sort of frame that.
Because education is a key piece.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I mean, so, our job is to create demand, right? That's sort of what advertising does. And if it's demand for something that doesn't exist before, then yes, we've got to get people excited and interesting and knowledgeable of that product or service so that they suddenly start buying it when in the past they were living their lives perfectly happily without doing so. If you have, let's say, an unlimited amount of money, then, we would be talking about a mass marketing campaign using a combination of channels. One of the things that regardless of, what the objective would be, is we plan these days for what we call the bottom up. So what we mean by that is to say, what is the point of transaction? What is that moment when the consumer does the thing that you want them to do? And if it's a new product, when are they buying that product? What does that experience look like? Is it a frictionless experience? Have we understood what the customer's needs are in that moment of purchase? And if we can make that as easy as possible for them, that's the first step. And you'll be amazed how often that doesn't happen, right? It seems common sense, but often you try and buy something on a website on your phone, and for whatever reason, it just becomes harder than you would be prepared to put up with, and you walk away. So we've got to get that right at the start. You've got to make that absolutely seamless and perfect. And then you build backwards, right? So you go, okay, well, what's brought them to this point of purchase? And we start to attribute further and further up what we call the marketing funnel. So we then look at all these different points of conversion, and that conversion could just be moving from awareness through to consideration. But at the very top of the funnel, there is that education phase. That's that first moment of sort of getting people aware that the product exists and what it does. And there's different channels and different mechanisms that you would use to make that as compelling and as interesting as possible. When you get down here, it's much more technical, and you sort of move away from that. But at first, what we would say to our clients is, most products, to get people interested in them, a rational argument is going to be quite hard unless you're solving a problem. That's not really going to motivate people. What people respond to is a more emotional message. Is there something here that makes me feel a certain way? Have I triggered an emotional response from the audience? And in that first instance, that's what we're trying to find, that insight, that moment, that mechanism that's going to get someone's heart racing a little bit faster. And if we do that, then we start cutting through. We start moving our advertising into that 1%. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that. What is it that's going to get someone excited or feeling a certain way? There was an old sort of advertising phrase that if you think about advertising at large, it kind of falls into 4 categories. You've got guilt, you're guilted into doing something. Fear, you're scared of doing it or not doing it.
Insurance.
Aspiration, right? So this thing's going to be better for me in some way. And then I always added a 4th one, which was annoyance, which is just make this ad stop, right? I just got to get past it. So, okay, you sell doors, I get it, I know that. And if you sort of use those 4 very broad buckets, then that starts to take you down the pathway of, okay, if this is about aspiration, if I'm selling someone a new car or a holiday or something, what's the emotional hook that makes my car better than all those other competitors' cars? And once we've understood that, we want to tell that story in a really rich and engaging way using, channels like television. Television is still the preeminent way to tell a story because you've got that audio visual opportunity with audiences. And television these days, you've got broadcast, but you've got video on demand, you've got catch up, even cinema. So that channel layer at the start is really, really important. And then you want to take them on the journey. So that funnel that I mentioned. So from awareness to consideration to purchase or action, the transaction itself. And then, the other part of the funnel is it then opens up into this whole new world where we want the consumers to advocate on behalf of the product. So if I do buy a new car, the first thing I want to do is tell Dev and say that this new car is fantastic, mate.
And join a club.
Join the club. Now, that is actually the most powerful marketing channel in the world because my personal endorsement to you, someone that hopefully you trust and, respect, is going to do, 1,000 times more effort than the best ad we could ever put on TV.
As you talked about that, the extreme end when the decision is made by the consumer, and the consumer psyche and consumer buying behavior is very plays a critical role. For example, you're at Harvey Norman or one of these retail outlets, you're buying a piece of electronic, and the price of that is $1,000, and then with another $50 you can get 2 years worth of warranty. It's a 1 year warranty which comes as a default, but we'll give you 2 more years. And one of those tricks, plus to change consumer behavior to spend more, and or things like afterpay and then buy now pay later kind of. So how has that driven the consumer behavior to for good and bad?
I think the afterpay one's interesting. I mean, certainly that's about removing friction at that point of transaction. So, as a consumer, I might not have the $1,000 in my wallet at that time, but here's a way that I can buy this product without having the money immediately available, which is, incredibly powerful, right? Now your conversion rate is going to start increasing because you've created another mechanism whereby they can afford the purchase. Those cross-sell opportunities, those upsell opportunities, often at that point of purchase is when the consumer is, and I use the word in inverted commas, the most vulnerable, because you've now committed to this purchase. The emotional state is okay. There's that immediate sort of twang of okay, I'm excited, but also perhaps a little bit nervous that I've committed to buying this thing. And the retailer in that instance understands that is the moment to start offering these other services, right? Especially extended warranties and so on. They won't start with that. They'll wait for the purchase and then bring that in as a moment, because that's when there is a greater mental availability and susceptibility to a sales message like that.
Why in your 4 categories of titles of ads, why there is no categories or there is no ads of happening of coffee beans or coffee as such?
Well, I like the George Clooney ones with the the little pods. Yeah, they're always fun. And I think he's quite good because he takes the mickey out of himself and of the whole process, which I enjoy. And then there's one I noticed recently. It's very stylized, very aspirational. I think a lady in an Italian, beautiful sort of hilltop Tuscan town drops her coffee jar and it rolls down the streets and a handsome young man picks it up. And I think the promise at the end of the ad is that they've fallen in love over this sort of coffee jar, and all of the emotional stuff that comes with that. I mean, it's just pure aspiration advertising, right?
I would always love the FIFA or World Cup ads when the balls would, somebody will kick the ball, it'll go to a different station and it'll just go around the world. And those are very,
I think
very well done.
Australia did it for their bid to host the World Cup, and I think there was. I can't remember who was the Prime Minister at the time, but the ball sort of bounced on his desk and then out shot, and then it flew somewhere else. So, those are good funds. I mean, we do sort of have this sort of hit list of when you make an ad, right? If you don't have a great idea, like something really powerful that's emotionally engaging, then there's other levers we can pull, right? And often it's things like that where you've got something that's unusual for the audience to see, those rapid cuts of a ball moving around different locations and the Prime Minister. That's a different way to hook someone in. It can be very effective. But it's interesting that they're memorable because, you and I could talk about the best ads that we can recall. Some of them go back 20, 30 years perhaps to our childhoods and so on. So when you get it right, the effect can go for decades, and some of it enters the mainstream and we just use it in our vernacular. Just do it right, and we use that phrase all the time, not necessarily in relation to buying a new pair of sneakers. So it's interesting.
So from an aspirational format of ads, which is which you talked about, to more darker ads, which is the political ads, so which we have seen, which typically harpers on the other side's negative, the darker tones and a bit of bassy sound coming in the background, dark colors,
the fear,
and the lighting is a bit more darker, and they change the faces and a bit more grumpy looking face.
Yes.
So what's the structure when somebody comes to you guys and say, we want to run these political ad campaigns, and we're designing those ads? What's the style of thinking? How do you think about it?
Yeah, and I think for me personally, I'm not sure they're as effective as politicians and political parties believe them to be. But obviously they want to do them because they're becoming, they are mainstream now. We see it election cycle after election cycle. And if you go to, markets like the US, they're probably even more aggressive. So they are trying to tap into that emotion of fear, that there is a scary consequence of picking that politician. And they're trying to sort of showcase that. The fear is, it's not always a negative. It can be a positive. So if you think about social marketing, getting people to stop doing things that are bad for their health or making people aware of health issues. So some of the most famous advertising from the 80s was around the AIDS epidemic and, trying to basically scare people into changing their behaviours to stop HIV from spreading. So, it can be a very powerful force in that regard. But, with regards to political advertising, if you're an undecided voter and you start seeing those really negative ads, and like you say, everything about it is dark and menacing and, it's a grey environment and all the rest of it. It's all designed to sort of start to what we call cueing the audience. So there's visual cues, there's audio cues, and those include things like colours and soundtracks and imagery. And those cues, your imagination is filling in a lot of the blanks, right? Because most time you've got a window of about 30 seconds. So in that 30 seconds, you're probably not going to solve the whole client brief in that one window. But what you want to do is plant all these seeds, right? And then the consumer starts going on this journey and, that politician, he's going to destroy the country, right? And, you sort of want to sort of plant that. Look, for my money, I think, and maybe the last election in Australia sort of proved this to a degree, the more aspirational political messaging are the ones that motivate people. I think, we would rather hear a good news, positive story that's something that we can believe in and get motivated by that than act out of fear. And again, there's probably a ratio of fear and aspiration that these campaigns want to take to market. But I think the aspirational ones are probably the more powerful.
And one of yours was annoyance. And during the last couple of elections, the trumpet of patriot SMS came to everybody. Yeah. So I think, could you also suggest the idea or explain the idea of privacy through that and the spamming, some regulations and what is allowed, what's not allowed.
Yeah. It's interesting because with that, and I was a recipient of those texts and, I think like the rest of the country probably found them very annoying. The weird thing is, and it's sort of almost counterintuitive, but for political advertising, the rules are different. And if Harvey Norman started spamming you with that, they would be in breach of the advertising code and potentially be in trouble and receive a large fine. But when it comes to political campaigning during the election window, those rules don't apply to the political parties. They can get away with it. So that, I think, is something that seems weird, right? That they would have that permission during that period. Obviously, it didn't work for them. I think, what the true agenda and strategy was behind that campaign is probably for politicians to...
If that comes on your desk as a case study, the effectiveness of money spent to number of votes garnered...
Terrible. The return on investment was appalling. I think the last figure I saw, the Trumpet of Patriot campaign, I think had a media spend of about 60 million nationally. I think in the final reckoning it might turn out to be a bit more than that. For almost no political gain whatsoever. So again, you question why they're doing this and what sits behind it. Was it to win political power, or was there some other agenda at play? But I don't recall seeing anything in that campaign that was interesting or effective. If you look at some of the ads, they were really awful ads. I don't know that they in and of themselves was going to convince many people one way or the other, or probably did turn people off. I think those spam texts, again, why? You're just annoying people now. Just a complete waste of money, but who am I to say why they did it? I'm not sure.
And staying within the politics side of it, the new way of interacting with the younger audience or younger consumers of who are voters, who will be voting through different channels like TikTok, Instagram, and Spotify, Apple, iTunes. People, the medium of podcasting, the medium of long form conversation, picked up, and we observed what happened in the US, and we tried to replicate in Australia. And so, what are your observations on that, and what worked and what hasn't worked?
I think this is a fascinating area. I think if you look at the last 12 months, so much has been on fast forward because of these political campaigns around how these channels are working and how effective they are. I mean, if you start with the US election, Trump was very effective in this space. Went on the Joe Rogan show, the world's largest podcaster. I mean, the interesting story there is Joe Rogan was originally a Harris supporter, had said bad things about Trump, had invited Harris to the podcast. They never heard back from the Harris campaign, so she didn't attend. Trump got an invitation, went on, I guess with nothing to lose really at that point, sat down with Joe Rogan for 3 hours, unfiltered, right? It's just Joe and Donald chatting. And I think the final audience reach during the campaign, the podcast had 25 million views on YouTube, had 40 odd million views on Spotify. So this had gargantuan reach, cost the Trump campaign nothing in terms of expenditure, just 3 hours of his time. And by the end of the podcast, Joe Rogan had flipped. He became a Trump supporter. He was actually there on the stage when the election results were announced. And there's so much to unpack in this. So if we start with the medium itself, I'm a huge podcasting advocate. It's often been the case in my career that you take a fairly agnostic view around channels because they all have attributes, pros and cons around using radio versus TV versus outdoor. With podcasting, I find myself being very supportive of it as a channel because it does things that are fairly unique. So the people that are watching that interview with Donald Trump, they've made a very deliberate, conscious choice to consume that content. It's not been fed to them. They've gone out and solicited it and got it. So that's powerful. It's a very personal environment. So often you're watching it on a smartphone with your headphones on. So you're not distracted. You've got it 100% coming at you. The bleed between editorial and advertising is non-existent. You know, what you're hearing and seeing is basically the message that they want you to consume, or at least their version of it. The person that you're watching, if you're watching Joe Rogan, you've made a decision to follow him, right? So he has influence over you. You know, this is someone that you're sacrificing time to spend with, even though he doesn't know who you are. But you built a relationship in your own mind with them, and that gives them enormous influence. So, and you got 3 hours of attention, right, through that process. And it's a very high attentive media. That's one of the things we look at these days in terms of channel selection. What is the audience's attention for that particular channel? And in this instance, it's through the roof. So you've got all of that part and parcel of the channel. So it's a really compelling place to be. The other dynamic that sort of makes it attractive is this notion of share of voice, which is a marketing term. But in that environment, you're not hearing from Harris. You're only hearing from Trump. So Trump has 100% share of voice. It's huge. Now you take a step back and we go, okay, strategically, you've got all these great attributes around the channel and that environment, but you've also now talking to an audience. And the Joe Rogan audience, for the most part, is young males. Now, when we deconstructed the US election, we looked at what we call, we looked at it through a marketing lens. And from a marketing lens, you go, okay, well, it's a duopoly contest. It's Trump versus Harris. It's Coles versus Woolworths, right? You've got two brands that are competing. And for those two brands, political, parties, majority of voters are rusted on voters, right? That I'm a Republican voter and I've been voting Republican my whole life. So it's really hard to shift them. It's like getting a Qantas frequent flyer to switch to Virgin, right? It's a hard task. But what Joe Rogan offers is an opportunity to talk to an audience that perhaps have never voted before. And in marketing terms, we call this a category entry point. So this is a suite of consumers that are voting for the first time. They're reaching adulthood. And as a consequence, they don't have any baggage from past elections. They haven't made, a loyalty for the most part. Some have, but for the most part, they haven't sort of locked themselves into one particular party over the other. So as consumers, they're up for grabs. So again, with Qantas and Virgin, it might be the first time they start flying independently, right? And now, for Virgin and Qantas, you want to get that person then. Because if you lock them in then, you potentially have them for the rest of their lives flying. So what Joe Rogan represents is a category entry point for first-time voters. And the largest cohort of first-time voters in the last US presidential election were young males. So there's more young males becoming members of the electorate for the first time than any other demographic, slightly ahead of young females. So this podcast, in this particular one, and Trump did a few of these, was consumed by that audience in way greater numbers than are watching CNN or MSNBC or reading the Wall Street Journal, right? They're not in those places, but they are here. So the genius of that particular thing for Trump was, I'm talking to people that haven't made their minds up to vote.
Yeah.
I'm getting them with 100% share of voice. I'm getting Joe Rogan as an influencer endorsing what I'm saying. I've got 3 hours of their unfiltered, undistracted attention, and it's incredibly powerful. And as a consequence, we've seen Australian politicians try and replicate it. The problem for the Harris campaign, they missed that window. They didn't see the opportunity. And Trump, it was a narrow election. We know it was a close run thing. I think that if you looked at one single thing that helped tip the balance, that was probably it. There were probably other things that contributed, but if I had to pick one moment, I would say that was one of the most successful.
Can I draw a somewhat parallel?
Sure.
Not that as big as Joe Rogan is Abby Chatfield. Mm-hmm. So she interviewed Albanese, and then she interviewed Adam Bant, and then she endorsed Adam Bant. And Adam Bant lost his seat.
Yeah.
So she had a big media following, and in terms of the size of Australia, she has enough following. And at the opposite happened. What happened with Joe is Trump won, and the Greens were wiped out almost in the parliament.
I mean, and there's probably a lot of factors that led to that.
Yes.
But I think this is the key point around these, individuals and the audiences that they follow. I would suggest most Abby Chatfield viewers are probably already predisposed to voting Labor or on the left of politics because of our own politics. That's what attracts you as the audience to that person, because they reflect your views and the things that you're interested in. And with Joe Rogan, although he was originally a Harris supporter, his audience was probably more apolitical in the sense that they hadn't, quite locked into one party or the other. But there was probably a greater affinity to someone like Trump versus Harris for a lot of those people. So it kind of worked there. Here, I think, are you going to convince someone that wasn't going to vote for you to vote for you? Well, I don't know that her audience would have been as open to convert as perhaps the Rogan one was. But and look, they've understood this. They've seen what's happened in America. They've seen that this is a big opportunity to reach their voters. And the risk you run is you're sat there in that sort of environment. If you don't give a good account of yourself, then the reverse is true, and you potentially risk losing voters. So it's interesting.
And pathway to addressing the public at National Press Club is either you are a Polly or you are a journal of some sort. And then last week, Hannah Ferguson was up there, and then her pathway was influencer / podcaster / all those new age media terms for her. Mm-hmm. So is that a seismic shift or the start of the new format of media?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I guess, just to refer back to the US election, when they, after Trump was elected and his press secretary came out and was quite overt that, that famous scene in the White House where you've got all the journos shouting questions to the press secretary, they said straight away, the people that are in the front row aren't going to be the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. It's going to be influencers. It's going to be podcasters. They're going to get the first question. And they're selected, right, because their views reflect the Trump views. And now we're seeing this also in Australia. It is a seismic shift. There's no other way to describe it. If you look at traditional media channels, which over time have been the mainstay of political advertising and where you would go to get political information as an audience, so you think about television news and newspapers, those audiences are rapidly declining. If you look at just CNN, probably the most famous news TV brand in the world, the 24 election versus the 20 election, they lost a third of their audiences in one electoral cycle. Their audiences declined by a third. So the total reach of CNN through the US election was about 20 million people. It's not a huge number for a country the size of America. Now look at TikTok, look at Spotify, look at YouTube. The reach is through the roof. And what works in those channels isn't this sort of polished, crafted TV news type environment or long-form written journalistic type articles. it's authentic. It's people talking to other people that are very relatable, that you have an audience that's naturally attracted to the show, and as a consequence, you then get to pass the message through that. So, yeah, it has changed completely. If you look at young people in America through the election, the research showed that they rated TikTok as their number one source of information about the election. Now, that has lots of implications because there's no rules on TikTok and, around journalistic integrity and things like that. People can get away with all sorts of things. But the audiences themselves are now voting with their sort of feet and clicks and are going in that direction. And yes, it doesn't surprise me at all that, even the title, the National Press Club, is anachronistic, right? How many people are reading newspapers today versus consuming TikTok or YouTube? They should probably come up with a new name. And it's absolutely correct that they're bringing powerful influencers that are using these channels to communicate to their audiences into that environment, because the other side is quite scary in terms of the implications for democracy and truthfulness in political advertising.
When you use the acronym of National Press Club is NPC, in the gaming world, the NPC is called the non-player character.
That's right. Yeah, my son taught me that, which kind of says it all, really. Right? You're not even a character anymore. You're not a playing character. You're just a bystander. And I think I think journalists love it, right? You get to go and have lunch and you hear these people speak, but how much of that filters into the rest of the community? Probably not much.
Wow. Can you also give a bit more of your view on the UK politics, in which the mainstream politicians from Conservatives and the Labour Party were given enough media on the mainstream, but the UK Reform Party, which is Nigel Farage, who used podcasting, TikTok to the max, and then he got almost a third of the primary vote.
Yeah.
There's only primary vote there.
Yeah.
Third of the vote, but not too many members in the party. But now they have done another round of council election. They have gained a lot of traction. So how much that you would put that to the new age media?
Yeah, Farage is close to the Trump camp. I think they learned a lot of lessons from the US and applying those lessons in the UK. The UK is different again in terms of the media landscape and what the rules are in terms of political advertising. So it doesn't give you the same range of opportunities as perhaps you might have in America. But the nice thing, again, one of the things about podcasting and so on is there's no way of controlling it, right? So whatever rules and regulations the government might have for TV broadcasting doesn't really apply in that environment. So you have an opportunity to do things that you might not be able to do in other environments. The growth of the Reform Party and the politics of it all, there's lots of different things that are influencing that. But I guess one of the things that as a brand that they've understood is that being a disruptor, being a challenger is very appealing in a marketplace that for decades has been dominated by two entities, and those brands are getting tired, right? The Conservative and Labour brand in the UK, people, it's not that exciting, right? These guys have been around forever. They're probably not doing what we want them to do. And as a consequence, those brands have become quite dated. And then you've got Reform, like it or loathe it. It's new, it's interesting, it's fresh, it's different. And as a consequence, it captures the imagination. It can do things.
It has a colour of teals.
So, yeah.
Teals colour.
Yeah, and even that, right? I mean, if you think about the coding, you've got this instant acknowledgement that Labour red and Conservative blue. And they're not stupid. They're not going to follow that. They're going to come up with a whole new colour, like the teal colour. And straight away, there's a cue that says, in my mind, that's different. I've not seen that in this environment before. What are they about? So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack in terms of how these new political brands market themselves. And often it's about being what the other people aren't rather than what you are. And that's what the audiences are attracted to.
The traditional brick and mortar businesses, which are trying to use and have been an old school business, and they've been running for long, and they're used to a style of branding and ads, and then how do they seek new customers or consumers. How comfortable they are in shifting the gears into, I'm not running ads anymore. I want to create organic content now. So different mindsets, create one highly, commercialized video ad versus, create organic content, which is just normal conversation every day, all day long. So how is that mindset shift happening from a point of view of brick and mortar businesses?
Yeah, I mean, it's such I would be if I was a bricks and mortar retailer, that physical environment, the physical interaction with the customer, it's your greatest strength, but also your greatest vulnerability. If you think about e-commerce, we talk about removing friction and just making it easy, but the experience for customers is pretty understood, right? Go to the website, pick the product, put it in the shopping basket, try and transact. A week later, the stuff comes to my door. It's a non-human process for the most part, and again, the expectations from the consumer are quite low. If you're a bricks and mortar retailer, you are going to find yourself face to face with your customers. So you're going to have a human interaction. Someone in your store is going to talk to the customer, and they're going to have an interaction. And the success of that interaction will determine how much they buy in that transaction and whether they ever come back again. So it's huge risk, but huge reward if you get it right. And if you look at probably the most successful brand in Australia at the moment, Bunnings, which has recently had some bad press, we talk about that, but what do they put in their ads? It's their staff. It's what that expectation of the experience is going to look like. I'm going to walk into a Bunnings, I'm going to find someone that's super knowledgeable, and they're going to give me the advice I need to complete that project back at home that I'm popping in to buy the stuff for. Does it always happen that way? I'd say it's hit and miss, but that's how they position that brand. So they're very conscious of trying to bring that physical experience of buying into the advertising and set an expectation. And lots of bricks and mortar brands follow this pattern to varying degrees, and they look at how that physical transaction process is going to work for the customer. And sometimes, if you go to an Apple store, right, it's a completely different retail experience. There's not an obvious checkout, right? There's not some place that you're going to line up to buy the product. You're going to interact with a salesperson. They're going to give you some form of experience around the product and the brand, and they'll buy there and then, and you walk out and happy days. So the ones that sort of understand this and innovate in this space are the ones that are capitalising on the reward opportunity. And it makes you want to go back to Apple and go back to Bunnings. I think Mecca are quite interesting, the makeup brand, how they do things. That in-store experience is interesting in that regard as well. But for others, if I go there on a Saturday and I've got a teenager serving me who's tired and grumpy and, they don't really care because they're on minimum wage and the experience is a poor one and they can't answer any of my questions, then the risk is enormous and you're potentially losing a customer. I mean, we're seeing now in the UK, the supermarkets are replacing the automated checkouts and bringing human tellers back. So you go, economically, how does that make sense? It's a huge cost because the experience is so critical. People hate the automated tellers. They hate having to do this for themselves. And in a industry with such fine margins, you're better off having them go through a till with a conveyor belt and someone scanning the goods for them. That's a better customer experience. So, I mean, this whole space is ripe for disruption. Some people are doing it well, some people aren't. I think one of the things that we see in the e-commerce space over time has been this shift of what you're prepared to buy online and what you're not. So if you go back 20 years when we started buying things online, I think we were a little bit nervous about buying a holiday, right? That you would, historically you go to a travel agent or you phone someone and you book a holiday that way. Then you start buying them online and you think, hey, now it's commonplace. You wouldn't think twice about booking an airline or a hotel online, right? Things that you've never maybe seen in the real world, you buy them online. Commonplace. We're now seeing cars starting to be bought online, virtual test drives, things of that nature. It's a huge, big ticket item. And we've got a client that's a home builder and we had a meeting with them the other day and we're like, has anyone bought a home online yet? We joke now, that's such an enormous, the biggest purchase of your life.
We're doing Airbnbs online. Yeah. It's semi-buying a house for a weekend.
For a weekend, right? And, maybe that's the experience that you give someone. I mean, it's so interesting to see how, and so the threats to bricks and mortar are enormous. I mean, I would be terrified to have a business that was solely reliant on physical retail to sale. And some businesses are trapped because they operate as franchises or whatever, that they can't scale an e-commerce solution for their customers. So they're completely reliant on people coming in store. I mean, just the notion of that coming in store, that I'm going to give up a big proportion of my time to leave my house, to go to the store. A lot of this is going to feel very anachronistic in the future when drones are flying by, dropping off the goods, an hour later. So, yeah.
I think in those 4 categories, I should add the 5th one should be called cringe.
Yeah. There's plenty of that.
That's it. So we want to add cringe in there because when those hyper localized, physical ads on the bench, on the bins and those, property agents and all of that. So what do you see in terms of from a creative point of view?
Yeah.
Evaluate them, those ads.
Like I said, I like to be media agnostic. So it's about looking at
But still, evaluation.
So there's pros and cons around those things. And, for the people that are advertising on those what we call street furniture, so the stuff that's out in the suburbs, the benches, the bus stops, the bins and so on. I mean, for a lot of them, it would fall under what we refer to as local area marketing. So that particular business, its customer base is just within that catchment. Yeah. So the media choices are limited, and these things are there. They're usually quite cheap, so you don't have to invest a lot of money to do them. And often, they're all generic, right? You see the picture of a person, whether it's a real estate agent or whoever, the brand name and a call me today for an appointment or whatever the call to action is, right? It's pretty basic stuff. The problem, so you've got, good pros in terms of, well, I'm reaching the right audience because they're all in that particular area. It's relatively low cost. If I buy it, then a competitor can't. So my share of voice I'm protecting in that particular location. And that's why you see these things there month after month after month, because the risk is you give it up, you won't ever get it back. So then you get into the cons, and the cons are, well, it's fairly low impact. And street furniture, it's, you think, okay, I'm going to put it by the side of the road because there's going to be more traffic. But people are driving, so their attention around the bus shelter is fairly limited, and, the exposure lasts a fraction of a second. So, that impact is low. That attention score that I mentioned is very low in those environments. But you get a lot of frequency as well because people's routes, by and large, stay the same following their routines. And because the ads aren't that interesting, unless you're really in the market for a real estate agent in that moment, you're probably not paying them any attention whatsoever. So, advice to clients, and we do some local area marketing for clients because it is, it's moving us down that funnel to closer to the point of transaction. We want to make sure that there's a presence there. Do things that are a bit more interesting. The medium itself is ripe for disruption. So, the best bus stop advertising you'll ever see is bus stop advertising that breaks the format of the bus stop advertising. So it's not just the poster in the light box, it's something that takes over the whole bus shelter, right? Then that becomes interesting, it becomes unusual, it captures the eye and attention. But when you're in that sort of really passive media environment and you've got passive creative running on it, the return on investment is probably quite low, and you're probably doing it because you don't have any other choices. The nice thing about, the modern era is all these, major digital platforms, we have the ability to geo-target. So, we can start bringing local area marketing into Facebook, into TikTok and so on. And that then creates, great democratization of those channels for advertisers that in the past could probably not afford to be there because their reach, their footprint as a business is so small. Facebook it got itself in a little bit of trouble recently. It sort of came out with this sort of sideways claim that it was going to displace media agencies, traditionally their biggest customers, and offer a direct-to-advertiser mechanism to buy Facebook ads. And they quickly backtracked on that because, they kind of realised that we've got billions of dollars coming from these guys. We don't want to piss them off too much. But you can kind of see that trend line continuing to grow. That if I'm running a real estate agent in Joondalup, then I can just do my own marketing through these platforms, and their job is to make that easy for the layperson to do.
From a gambling point of view, can you bit more explain what's the consumer psyche at the final touch point, as well as the consumer ads? Because now there've been talks about banning the TV ads, only on socials is allowed. So the consumer psyche from a gambling point of view and the ads on the other side.
Yeah, I think in Australia we have been sleepwalking a little bit in this regard. The rules here are probably not as tight as you would find in other jurisdictions, and I think that's had a lot of negative impacts in the community. I know there's a lot of talk in the media when it comes to this stuff that, kids that are seeing these ads while they're watching AFL on TV, are then referencing the odds to their friends because, they're seeing that as part of the broadcast, and then they just assume that's part and parcel of how you talk about the sport. The Lions are, favourites, they're paying $2. Why does a 12-year-old need that knowledge? They don't. So I think we've been too lax in Australia. I'm all for deregulation, but I think the opportunity to reach vulnerable members of the community in these environments is so great that we do need to sort of take some action to protect them. I noticed recently that I won't say the brand, but a very big gaming advertiser, used to do within the AFL telecast halftime semi-live type TV spots, talk about how the game was going, how the odds were changing, and that stopped. And I think because they recognise that while the legislation hasn't caught up, society is beginning to react negatively to this, and their social licence to operate is becoming vulnerable. And so they've taken corrective actions. They're kind of self-policing a little bit, but we need to go further because it is just, it's becoming omnipresent within these sports. And I know it generates a lot of income for the sports and so on, and they become reliant on that to a degree. But I don't think it's healthy for 12-year-olds to talk about the odds of, what team's going to win which football match. That's not the conversation I think we would want young people to be having. So we've got to probably move the boundaries a little bit towards protecting those people in the community. I mean, the reality of gambling these days is it's so ubiquitous. Like, you can do it on your phone instantaneously. It's not like when you have to physically go into the betting shop and there was only one and it was a fairly austere place full of, old people smoking, right? That experience is gone. And as a consequence, because it's so much easier now, the friction is removed to such a degree, and kids are, in particular, so smart when it comes to these kind of technologies that it's just huge risk in terms of, creating, potentially addicts out of very young people when it comes to this stuff. So we've got to police it better.
And then from a gambling, I think the next logical conversation for younger people is, when they play gaming on phone and the sneaky version of not an ad, but buying a new weapon or buying a new, shield on your body for that game. It's just still an ad. Yeah. You're paying up and then there's dad's credit card in there.
Yeah. I've been on the receiving end of this. I know exactly how it goes.
So because that's also very consumed media. You are putting a headphone, like Joe Rogan 3-hour interview, consuming that consumed. And the friction is already reduced because it's not my money.
Oh, wait, the friction
as it is my parents' money.
And it works in reverse, right? So the friction of playing the game increases if I don't buy this thing, because now I've got this extra weapon that enables me to perform better in the game. Gaming, I think people don't see the iceberg of gaming, and I'm not saying this in a negative way. Gaming is a gargantuan part of people's media lives these days. It is an enormous industry worth billions and billions of dollars. And I think people underestimate the scale of this. The time that young people spend gaming across all different types of platforms, from consoles, PCs through to smartphones, etc. It is, for many people, their number one media channel. And as you mentioned, the immersive experience of playing, because the technology is so sophisticated, it is all encompassing, right? So you've got the audio visual, the interactivity. So for advertising, this is, an enormous opportunity. And some brands are beginning to understand that and are investing more in it. And it's quite surprising when you look at the brands that are in this space and ones that are successful and not successful. And I think people are still figuring this out, because that environment is one that the player is so engrossed in. If as a brand you're not bringing value to that experience of playing, then you are going to become alienated as a consequence. And we've got examples of brands that have failed. They've tried to do it and have failed. The ones that do it, the payoff is huge. Like the way that players then respond to that brand, not just in the gaming world, but in the real world as well, is enormous. So it's featuring more and more in the marketing strategies we develop for clients, is getting advertising messaging into the gaming world. And there is a huge opportunity there. That in-game purchasing, the e-commerce that occurs through the playing thing, it's often the way that the business model for the software is built, right, that the cost of developing this stuff is enormous. But that's often not going to be compensated through purchasing the game. A lot of the games are free, and if they are, or if they're not, they're on that freemium model where you might pay a residual amount to start playing. But how they make money, how the game developers make money, is through all the in-app purchases, in-game purchases. And they are very sophisticated at sort of developing this. The ones that are the best, I think, is when the purchase forms part of the narrative. So it's a thing that helps you play the game better. Why wouldn't you do that? But other instances where it's superficial and it doesn't really contribute, then again, the risk kicks in and you've got to be careful of not annoying the audience versus, getting them, enjoying it and playing along with you. But this, as a media, we talked a lot about podcasting, and that is now, it's not emerging anymore. It's very established. To say gaming's emerging is probably a bit anachronistic as well. It's a big channel. It's a big opportunity for advertisers. I think you'll see this scale rapidly over the next sort of decade. It will become a much bigger part of advertising strategies.
I saw one of the Greens member of parliament was playing live game on TikTok.
Right.
So much so that the next one, which I want to talk about, radio. Radio is also typically, on the go, in your head or in the car, you're listening to it. But these days, most of the radio shows are being video recorded, and they put snippets and then on TikTok, so they push the traffic back to the channel. Yeah. Still an audio only. So I think probably how do you see that transformation of audio only to see that those characters, the three, RJs who are interactive and they are funny people and it's good fun. They are very expressive. They're very good actors, not actors probably, expressive people.
Yeah.
And it's fun to see them in action, and that's a good way to put the hook. On my TikTok feed, I keep on getting these young three young men from New Zealand.
Right.
And they're very funny.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying. That's the good hook to get you on the whole show. But how do you see that also another new age media?
Yeah, I mean,
and the old and the new.
And you can see the media transforming as this technology disrupts things around it. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. The key thing is the content itself. Is it interesting? Are you enjoying it? Because there's so many choices, right? So if they don't hook you in, you'll just move to another station or put Spotify on or whatever. So the obligation for the producer, the content itself to be compelling is through the roof, right? You've got to get that right first. So it's interesting that you've got a team in New Zealand who, if you go back 20 years, you would never have been able to hear them, right? Because the technology wouldn't have allowed them to be here. But now you can source them through all these digital platforms and so on. So, that's the key thing at the start. I mean, the radio stations, I think, were very quick to understand the threat of these emerging technologies and how they were going to disrupt a channel that, has a role in terms of people's lives, but it's a very defined role based on people's routines. So you listen in the car or you listen at work, and it's often, that complementary media to something else that's happening in someone's life. It's unlikely, and it used to be the case, but it's unlikely you go home, turn everything else off, just listen to the radio, right? Maybe 50, 100 years ago, that was the way things were done, but not anymore. So it's a complementary medium, and it needs then to find other ways to bring audiences in and to keep them engaged with that content. So, and there is a natural bleed, because it's an entertainment medium for the most part, there's a natural bleed between the content that's going out on air and then what would be replicated on TikTok, which is another entertainment channel, and so on. So if you're smart in radio, you want to build these ecosystems of content. The distribution, whether it's through audio broadcast through a transmitter versus an online broadcast versus stuff that's pre-recorded and then gets served through social media or through video channels. Yeah, you need to plan all of that, and you've got to be very deliberate in it as well. It can't just be by chance. You've got to think about how these different components work together, and then ultimately, where do you monetize that output? Where are you going to capitalize on that audience for advertisers? The nice thing about radio, which I've always enjoyed about it, is it's one of the most trusted mediums. So audiences, because they have this choice, when you pick a particular show to listen to, the trust with that environment goes through the roof. So for an advertiser, if you can have the talent talk about your product and endorse what you're doing, then that has a lot of influence with the audience and the consumer. So when we think about advertising on radio, there's usually a combination of things that we're doing. So there's what we would call the traditional radio ads that fall into those ad breaks, but we also love it and this is part of the process, is that we would pay for the talent to then talk about the product as part of the content as well. And having both is a very effective combination.
Mm-hmm. Things are changing very fast now. And in conclusion, I think I would want you to, for any mid-sized to large organizations who are planning their, the idea of messaging, the idea of presenting to the world who they are, what they are, whatever their objectives are, how should they rethink that initial brainstorming process within the senior exec team or CMO and all of those guys? What should they be, keeping on the table? Nothing should be off the table.
No, I mean, it's such an interesting dilemma because we've come out of a period of time where things have been done a certain way for a very long time, and as a consequence, people get very comfortable with that because it's the known. But now we're entering this period of unknown, right? These new things are changing things every day. I guess the biggest message to impart to people is that understand the balance of power has shifted. So the balance of power used to be that the media and the advertiser had an enormous amount of control over what the audience was seeing and doing. Now it's the other way around. The audience has all the control around what they see and do from the media and from advertisers. So when you think about your story and the messaging that you want to craft, you have to have the voice of your audience in the room with you. You need to hear what their need states are, how you're going to fulfill whatever it is that's missing in their lives by you promoting your product and service, and use that as the catalyst to develop the marketing that's going to come afterwards. If you play by the old rules, you will find yourself completely irrelevant. So, understand the audience, put them at the heart of what you do, make sure your brand is a brand that's going to, maximize their appeal for whatever reason, and then take it from there. And there's a process that then occurs, but that is the biggest shift I think that we would advise clients on.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tim.